What's up, guys? The plan today is to kind of keep on keeping on with westward expansion, and we're going to look at two more different groups of people who moved out west. We're going to look at the Cowboys and we're going to look at the Miners. So we'll start with the Cowboys. And so the Cowboys' job really came to be because of this animal. There were lots of Longhorns who were living out west, particularly in Texas, and so they were called Texas Longhorns. And what the Longhorn was is it was a giant cow or bull. And the thing about these 5 million Longhorns that lived in Texas is that they could be sold to make a lot of money. So the job of the cowboy was to sell these Longhorns to make a lot of money. And so what they would have to do is they would have to go on these really long cattle drives. And the way a cattle drive worked is the Cowboys would take all of the Longhorns and they would group them together and they would push them up to the nearest railroad. Well, the problem was the nearest railroad a lot of times was hundreds of miles away. And so these cattle drives lasted for weeks at a time, and they were having to cross entire states to get to the closest railroad in order to sell those cows to make money. And so cattle drives were a really big deal to the cowboy. It was the cowboy's job to go on these cattle drives. The most famous cattle drive trail is this Goodnight Loving Trail. And all it did is it crossed the entire state of Kansas. And so they would leave Texas and they would cross the entire state of Kansas on these cattle drives just to get to the nearest railroad. And so when you think about life for a cowboy, it really goes along the lines of life for everybody out west, and the fact that it was really difficult. To be a cowboy wasn't just a job, it was really a lifestyle. And so they had to work.
Franklin and Elena, come
Whoops,
to me so you can
interruption.
deliver your cookie dough. I am not your servant.
There we go. The life of the cowboy was difficult. They had to work all hours of the day. You see here 16 hours a day. That would give you 8 hours to sleep. And they work every day of the week. So 7 days a week, long hours, because they had to constantly watch these Longhorns. Because if they didn't, then the Longhorns would run away. And so you see here they would often have to take turns at night because, like I said, you had to watch these cattle at all hours to make sure that they stayed where they were supposed to be and didn't run away. One of the dangerous things about being a cowboy with all of these Longhorns is sometimes they would have these stampedes, and there were instances when cowboys were killed in these stampedes because these cattle drives, there were lots and lots of these Longhorns, and so if they decided to stampede, then it was really difficult to stop. And so cowboy life, again, like most people out west, it was really difficult. Another thing that you'll see is the fact that when we think about cowboys, a lot of times we think about white males with their big cowboy hats and that kind of thing, and that is true. But an interesting thing about the Cowboys is that actually a third of them were Mexican American or African American. A lot of African Americans who moved out west, those exodusters, they saw this as a way to make money, and so they became cowboys. And so, like a famous one would be Nat Love. And a lot of them were also Mexican Americans who had immigrated up from Mexico and took on the job of being a cowboy. And so, in a nutshell, that's what cowboy life was like out west, and that was kind of the role of the cowboy, to go on these cattle drives. Well, the cattle drives don't last very long for two reasons, and these are two very important reasons to remember. Two things ended the cattle drives. The first one was barbed wire fences. The ranchers and the cowboys did not get along with the farmers. What happened was when the ranchers and the cowboys would go on these cattle drives, they were going across the land that these farmers had gotten under the Homestead Act. So what the farmers did, and what one guy in particular did, is he came up with a barbed wire fence. It was a cheaper way to make fence, and they put this barbed wire fence around their land. And so let's say that we have our cows here, and our closest railroad is up here, right? So in order to get to that railroad, we would have to go on a cattle drive, right? We would have to drive. But let's say we're crossing somebody's land about here. So what the farmer would do is he would put barbed wire fence around his land, which would make it difficult. You could no longer go on your cattle drive through here, right? So you would have to go around. Well, then another farmer might build their barbed wire fence here, and so you couldn't go that way, and then another one here, and so you couldn't go that way. And so with the invention of the barbed wire fence, so many people started to wrap barbed wire fence, so many farmers started to wrap barbed wire fence that the cowboys could no longer go on cattle drives, and that made uh, life really difficult. And ranchers and cowboys did not get along with the farmers because of barbed wire fence. And then the other reason that cattle drives ended is because the railroads just got closer. So in this same situation, let's just say there's a railroad that comes right here. There would no longer be a need to go on your cattle drive all the way up here. You could just go straight here. And so cattle drives became less needed because the railroads started to extend and got closer to where the cows were. And so those are the two things that ended cattle drives: the barbed wire fence and the extension of the railroads. It is interesting to note that almost all of these railroads out west went back to Chicago. So Chicago was like the place to be if you wanted to sell your Longhorn or make money off of Longhorns or buy them. And so Chicago was kind of like this important city when it came to the end of these cattle drives. So that kind of ended the life of the cowboy. Cowboys in the traditional sense of people out west who went on these cattle drives did not last very long because of these barbed wire fences and railroads. And so that's the cowboys. And so that brings us to miners. When we think about miners, the biggest thing to remember when we think about miners is we're talking about people who went all the way out to California in a lot of cases. The homesteaders, the sodbusters, the pioneers in the middle of the West did not go all the way to California. The people who went all the way to California were out there really looking for gold. And so they were mining for gold. Now, one thing to know is when we talk about mining, we're not talking about actually digging under the ground for gold. We're talking about panning for gold, which you can see back here in this picture, where you took a pan and you put mud in it essentially, and you sifted water through it, and gold nuggets were kind of left over. So that when we talk about a miner during westward expansion, that's what they were doing, is they were panning for gold. So what would happen a lot of times is when miners would move out west and they would find gold somewhere, lots of people would rush to that area where they found gold. And what formed are what we call boomtowns. When people would find gold, it would be really, really exciting. And so people would rush to where they were finding the gold, and they would set up a town there. Well, when you set up towns, you have to have lots of different things. So you have to have hotels and places to stay, and restaurants and banks and those kinds of things. And so these boom towns would form. But the interesting thing is the fact that entrepreneurs were the ones who made the most money when it came to moving out west looking for gold. An entrepreneur is just somebody who starts their own business. And so in these boom towns, people would start their own businesses, and they would be entrepreneurs. They would start their own hotel. They would start their own bank and those kind of things. In fact, most people who moved out west never found gold. It's kind of interesting. I would say 90% of the people who went out to California looking for gold never found it. And so the people who actually made the most money during this rush for gold were the entrepreneurs, the people who started their own business, the people who sold all these people looking for gold things like shovels, or gave them places to stay, or gave them food. They were the ones who made the most money when it came to the gold rush. One really famous entrepreneur is this guy. You might know his product. Levi Strauss invented the blue jeans. What essentially happened was miners were having to get down on their hands and knees to pan for gold, and they were getting holes in their pants, and they were tired of getting holes in their pants. And so Levi Strauss saw that this was a problem, and he invented the fabric denim. And so with denim, he created the blue jean. And so Levi Strauss was one of those entrepreneurs who made tons and tons of money out west by being an entrepreneur and selling his product to all of the people who moved out west. So entrepreneurs became a really, really big part of this gold rush. And they were the ones who made the money. Another famous business that was started during this time is
Caitlin,
Wells
Elena,
Fargo.
Suzanne, go to my room.
Interruption. interruption, was Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo was a bank that was created during this westward expansion movement. So the entrepreneurs were the ones who made all of the money. And then, interestingly enough, when you had a boomtown and somebody found gold and all those people rushed there, they would stay for a little while, but once people realized that there wasn't any gold left, or there wasn't any silver left, or there wasn't any more gold, the people would leave and they would go to another boomtown. They would go to another place where they were finding gold, and what was left, or what we call a ghost town. So you would have someone find gold, all these people would rush there, they would create this boomtown. All these entrepreneurs would start their own businesses and they would make this money selling people stuff there. And then once they realized there wasn't any gold left, they would all leave and go somewhere else. And they left behind these ghost towns, which I think is really, really interesting. And it's interesting that a lot of these ghost towns are still standing throughout the West today. People just left the buildings behind. They would take their stuff and leave the buildings, and nobody would stay there. So we call those ghost towns. So it's interesting the way that the gold rush really turned out. You think that people would go and they would find gold and become rich, when in fact it was really the people who started their own businesses that became rich. So when you're thinking about Cowboys and Miners,
Ms. Franklin and Ms. Malden, please come to the conference room for your meeting. Ms. Malden and Ms. Franklin, they are ready for you in the conference room.
Another interruption. That's okay. So when you're thinking about Cowboys and Miners, the biggest thing to remember is that cowboys, their job was to go on these cattle drives and push these cattle to the railroads. And that lasted for a while until barbed wire fences and the extension of the railroads ended cattle drives. Life for the cowboy was really difficult. Again, it was a way of life. It wasn't just a job. And when you think about miners, the important things to remember are the fact that when miners found gold, they would form these boom towns, and the people who really made money during the gold rush were the entrepreneurs, the people who created their own businesses. And when they left, they would leave these ghost towns behind. Miners are going to play an important role when it comes to the conflict with Native Americans that we're going to be talking about next. But cowboys and miners are two important groups when we're talking about westward expansion in the late 1800s. So hope you have an awesome day. Appreciate it. See you later.